Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Karen Doyle and I'm Operations Director of CTAM Europe. I hope you're all feeling well, fit and healthy today. So let me introduce you to today's presenter, who you can see there on the screen, raring to go. Jonathan Broughton is Lead Analyst at Media Business Insights. We're excited for this as it's the first time Jonathan has done a webinar for us, hopefully not the last. Today's topic is Superformats, and he'll take us from when the original Superformats took the world by storm in the early 90s to the current time with the 10 key global new Superformats. If you aren't already a member of CTAM Europe and are joining us for the first time, we'll be setting you up with free membership of CTAM Europe to last until the 1st of June, so you can enjoy all the future weekly webinars we have planned. And you can also look back on the past webinars and podcasts from CTAM Europe and CTAM US in the members only area on ctameurope.com. So back to the webinar. We'd like it to be as interactive as possible. So please ask questions along the way by clicking your Q&A button on your screen. So sit back and enjoy, and I'll now hand you over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Karen. All right, let me pull up my presentation. Lovely. And away we go. Okay, so as Karen said, this is going to be as interactive as possible. So if you do have questions, please do type away. As well as that, I've got about 5 minutes at the end. So after I've been through the presentation, after I've been through the summary to the topics we've covered, there'll be a sort of a 5-minute gap there. So I'll prompt you at the end. But yes, as we're going through, I've got my Q&A panel open. And I'll do my best to address all of your questions as and when they come up. So the new Superformats. Let's jump in. Lovely. So this is the second report that we've written on Superformats. The first report was written back in 2018. And was something we produced for mid-markets. It was a bit of a freebie we put out where we decided there was some information to be discussed on the original Superformats. And frankly, the industry went a bit bananas. It turns out that there's not really been that much attention paid to these type of programs in the past, certainly from analyst firms, and certainly not putting it through the kind of analytical paces that we did so. Just want to talk about Superformats themselves. So what is a Superformat? So Superformat isn't just a term that I've made up. It refers to those non-scripted shows that debuted in the sort of early 90s onwards. They were repeatable programming that saw many adoptions across many different territories, and it set themselves apart from sort of adaptable formats, which could be adopted in a couple of markets, to what was then termed a super format, sort of a global or a globe-trotting type of programming. So yes, we produced this first report that in fact is still available on our website. So if you are interested in reading one of these or reading a little bit further about the old Superformats, do drop onto broadcastintel.com where you can download it for free. And our new report sort of brings a sort of second chapter to that. So rather than looking at what happened with those big formats of the 90s, what we did is we selected 10 shows that exemplify new Superformats. So it's a range of non-scripted shows. So these can be shiny floor or factual entertainment. We're not talking about documentaries or drama. And it looks across a range of topics, a range of themes, and a range of genres to try and give a nice breadth of the analysis that we're doing. So it's applicable to a wide range of shows which have global appeal. I'm just going to draw on the shows themselves. This report that we've just created would not have been possible without the help of these production companies that you can see here. So we reached out to them, we asked them for sales data, we asked them for broadcast data, so we can have a look at the life cycle of each of these shows. We can look at where they were sold, who bought them, who broadcast them, how they were renewed, and how their sort of life cycle developed. So a big thank you to the production company here. We, of course, as we always do, did a whole load of fact checking and making sure that all the I's and T's are crossed and dotted to make sure that the data is nice and comparable. But yes, as I mentioned, a big thank you to the production companies for helping us out with this. So we ended up with a couple of data sets. This is very briefly what you'll see in the profile sections of the report. You look at, well, we produce a section of analysis on each of these programs. I've taken the goggle box here. You can see where it was sold, who bought it, who broadcast it, and a little bit of analysis around why that's happened. But let's jump into the key findings. Let's talk a little bit about what we found from these shows. So what I've done here is I've normalized the data for sales for the formats that we covered. So this chart shows normalized data. So starting with year one of each of the shows, how many format sales that took place for that show on each year. And what we found is, in general, there's this kind of nice 6-year skewed bell curve in which sales for these formats can be maximized. We see a really prominent peak in year 2, where the formats are in the highest demand, and we also notice that this diminished after. Now, you may notice that I've slightly separated the Masked Singer in this. I've presented it as a solid bar, and I have presented it as a dashed bar, I guess you could call it. There's a good reason for this, which is essentially that while a lot of shows saw a bit of a refresh in year 5, the impact of the new version of the Masked Singer was so profound, it skewed our entire data set. So what I've done here is I've just let you see what the data looks like, both with and without the Masked Singer. I think that's quite important. The Masked Singer is quite an interesting story by itself, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next slide. But roughly, you can view it as a completely separate show to the original version. So in effect, it's kind of 2 shows, which is why I thought it was really important to separate this. But I think what's really striking about this data is that it suggests that these super formats must be sold with a really great urgency, certainly more than perhaps in the past. A new super format will gain traction immediately, but this represents a call to arms rather than a guarantee of success. There's a high degree that distributors of these kind of formats really have to work at them. So the Masked Singer, I thought I'd pull out the data for that show by itself because it's fascinating. You can see that in its early years, so 2015, 2016, 2017, you can see that in fact it didn't get that many format sales. And I've presented the transmissions, the broadcasts, as a cumulative data set on the line. And you can see that 2019, it makes more sales than it ever had in the past. And the story behind it is essentially that a Fox executive happened to be on holiday in South Korea and was just having lunch with his family. And lo and behold, in the corner of the room on a very small TV was the Masked Singer. And he was inspired by it, phoned up NBC, purchased the format and adopted it for broadcast on Fox network. And following this, within weeks, there was an international run on this format. It's a nice little lesson. It shows a couple of things. That one, there are lots of fantastic formats that still exist that we don't necessarily know about. If you reach outside the normal, there are perhaps some low-hanging fruit to be seen. And another positive lesson perhaps to take from it is that if you think a show that you are working with or someone is working with is absolute genius and nobody agrees, perhaps you're right and everybody's wrong. Just look at the Masked Singer and how it is perhaps the most important show in the world right now, despite not being picked up for 4 years. So going back to our sort of whole data sets, as I mentioned, we can also look at these split by sort of broad genres. So in this case, I've separated the shows by these genres. And again, I've averaged the sales per year across our 2 groups. These are no longer cumulative data. So shiny floor formats take marginally longer to gain traction than factual entertainment, losing out to the latter in sales in year 1, as you can see on the left. After this, however, shiny floors then tend to outsell factual entertainment. And in this kind of aggregated data set, the first few years, it's a nearly 2-to-1 basis. Additionally, they tend to perform a little bit more predictably. The variance in shiny floors productions was less than factual entertainment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But to delve a little bit further into that, here is a slightly complicated graph, so I'll talk you to it. This is a representation of factual entertainment sales. So I've switched to a cumulative view. Why this lets us get a better idea of the lifetime performance of a show. So the year-on-year graphs are really useful for seeing in general how things are performing, but they can be a little bit sporadic. This view lets us know how, in general, each of these shows has performed. And there's a high level of deviance within this data set that can be visualized. First off, the 2 bold lines, factual entertainment mean and factual entertainment median, are separated. And the separation indicates, or the wider the separation, the greater the difference in the data sets that are making that up. So essentially that demonstrates that there's a little bit of noise in this data. If we take, for example, year 2, the average sales are around 5. But at this point, Gogglebox, for example, has made 22 sales, and a couple of other formats are down near 0. And these are super formats, so they do pick up, they do start to sell. But there are a couple of shows which don't see immediate traction. And if you look into the nature of these shows, it becomes quite apparent why. With, say, a shiny floor production, perhaps it's a little bit easier to understand how that's applicable for your audience. With these factual entertainment shows, there's a more complex story that needs to be told, and that's really important if you're trying to get a commission or a sale of this type of show. So, for example, Gogglebox, which is a fairly simple premise, we see it rocketing up in its 2nd year. If you see something like Love Island or perhaps even the Secret Life of 4-year-olds, they take a little bit longer to adapt. Why? You have to explain the premise, you have to explain who it's applicable for. The production is harder, the audiences are perhaps a little bit more nuanced. What we do see, though, is that as you persevere with these, they do see traction. I'll talk a little bit about broadcast in a moment, but it's important to remember this is just for sales, so it doesn't necessarily represent total performance of a format. It represents kind of how easy it is to sell. So I'm going to jump onto shiny floor. So by comparison, those 2 bold lines, the mean and the median, they're much closer together. One of the reasons for this is that there's less deviance in the data set. In fact, one of the only things that created such a disparate data set, I should say, is again our friend the Masked Singer. There are a lot of production and adaptation factors which make these shows more easily adaptable. And you can see in this data itself a nice regular uptake across the board. Okay, let's talk for a moment around what happens after a sale. So even though these are super formats, even though they are globally known, they're household names, they cross countries, they cross languages, 45% of our formats that we chose failed to make it past their first year. Wait for a moment to let that sink in. 45% of these shows had only one season when they were adapted in the country, despite the fact the majority of them have done exceedingly well in their home market. So a takeaway for this is, if a sale has been made, it is by no means a indication that that format will then be successful. In fact, on average, including their home markets, series ran for 2.4 series, so really, really low. And obviously in their home territories, these formats tend to perform the best, but in general, they really struggled for longevity, despite the fact that they made a decent number of sales over their lifetime. So a couple of specifics, just to call out some household names, as I did mention that. So the Spanish singing format, Your Face Sounds Familiar, had the highest average number of runs per territory at 3.8. It was followed by Viacom International Studios distributed X on the Beach at 2.9. Studio Lambert's Gogglebox, which we mentioned before, averaged 2.8. So again, Gogglebox, which is our highest selling format, was by no means the most successful in terms of average run rate, even if it was in terms of total sales. So I mentioned the old report at the beginning of this presentation. And one thing, well, one is you can absolutely go and download that for free, but I've grabbed part of the data set and placed it here. So on the left, I have the old Superformats, and on the right, I have the new. Why have I done that? I thought it'd be really important to draw out how countries have perhaps changed a little bit over the last sort of 10, 15 years. We still see some of the same names at the top. So the UK, the USA, and you can't see it on the left, but the Netherlands adapted about 80% of the shows last time. So those territories still adapting quite a lot. But notably absent from this are some names. So Poland, Russia, Ukraine were very happy to adapt our old Superformats. They love shows like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Whereas our new shows, we found that we weren't seeing the same level of sell-through into those territories. Now they are slightly different data sets, so it's not like, but there is an indication that the way those territories now act is slightly different. And there are a whole number of reasons for that. I think first and foremost in my mind is that increasingly the market for these kinds of shows is crowded. Not only are they competing against each other, the other new Superformats, but they are in fact competing against the original Superformats. Shows like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire are still seeing new series across the globe, despite the fact that I get my maths right, is currently that I think it's in its third decade as a program. So it's not a fresh format by any measure, and yet is still a competitive threat almost to our new Superformats. And here we've just plotted the same data across the globe rather than just doing a top 10. Here is the world. In general, if we're looking at this on a region by region basis, and this is for the new formats, I should specify, not the old. Europe saw the most adaptations of any continent, but our lovely globetrotting Superformats traveled as far as Mongolia, as far as Chile, South Africa, and India. So they are truly global. Interesting, the last time we looked at these formats for our older sample, certain countries came out much, much higher. So you can see Eastern Europe is very pale here, India is pale, Mongolia is pale, and surprisingly Canada is as well. And that's a stark difference to last time. Now it's a slightly different data set, I do have to clarify, but it is striking that these countries have not adapted in the same way. Let's do a direct comparison over another line chart. So here I've taken, I've roughly imposed the life cycle of the new Superformats over that of the old. Now this is looking at territory by territory adaptations. It is not sales data. So if you're wondering why it is slightly different to the slide I showed you right at the start, is because this is based on broadcasts. So in a way, you could think of it as there being a delay in the data. It's similar, but perhaps it's a year behind almost, but not quite. So this looks at broadcasts, not format sales. And I have to say, the first time I imposed these data sets on each other, I was expecting to see quite a stark difference, to be honest. I was expecting old Superformats to be much higher in general, and I wasn't expecting to see quite a big spike as there is present here. But this chart shows the, some striking similarities. There's a near identical first peak in year 3, although old Superformats did build up slightly quicker before that. Where I do draw a significant distinction between our old Superformats and our new is that our old Superformats have continued to sell well into their 2nd decade, and sometimes even longer than that. This is partially due to lower competition when they were launched and a really established brand strength. It's easier to make the argument to adapt an old Superformat when you understand exactly how it's performed, exactly the demographics that you'll be hitting with it. Formats such as Big Brother and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire absolutely exemplify this. They do what they say on the tin and not a risk. At the same time, the new Superformats are launching into a really highly competitive and fast-moving marketplace. Consumers have many more options on where they can do their viewing. It's not just the impact of streaming or subscription VOD that I'm talking about. There are more channels that are available. There are catch-up services which are available. There are +1 feeds that didn't exist in the 90s, which means if your show is not immediately capturing that 6 o'clock or that 7 o'clock or that 8 o'clock slot of eyeballs, it is now much easier for a viewer to switch off. So good enough is no longer good enough. It has to be exemplary. As such, these Superformats that we see now, the new Superformats, they have to sell fast and they have to make an immediate impact to avoid being replaced. I just want to highlight the year 6 and 7 data on this. I think that's the key takeaway here. Although we know that our old Superformats sold, decades after their original conception, we can see here that our new Superformats are dying away in year 6 and year 7. Now, there may be a few outliers that buck this trend, but in general, we do see that year 6 and year 7, it almost seems like it was time to move on and push on with the next shiny, sexy new program. Okay, got a few slides left. Here I wanted to do a comparison of those old Superformats against the new ones, just to give you a real idea of what I mean when I say that I don't want to say it's easier, but perhaps more predictable. So here I've represented the lifetime of the various formats using, again, a cumulative format broadcasts. In this case, it's per territory, so you can roughly equate this to the number of countries that at some point decided to adapt and broadcast the format. I just want to quickly transpose this against one of our data sets from the past. You can see just visually, this is the technical term is the lines are all over the place. There's a much higher rate of deviance in this data set, which is the new Superformats, than there is of our old. Yes, there are a couple of breakaway shows within this data set itself. So Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? But in general, I would describe these shows as much better behaved. They perform in a more predictable way. They sell more regularly, and they generally had better performance when it came to renewals. Again, if we look at the end of this data set, years 6 and 7, there is slightly slower growth. That is true. However, notably, all of these shows are still growing. If we looked at our old data set, we'd in fact find that some of our shows had stopped selling entirely. Our new shows have stopped selling entirely. old shows kept going well into their sort of teenage years. Okay, so I'm just gonna sum up here. I've written some of the key points on the slide, but I did think of some extra things that verbally I kind of want to portray. So to sum up, with a few exceptions, most notably the Masked Singer, modern superformats experience a boost in sales in the second year since their first commission in their home territory. So that's how they behave. By the fourth year, superformats in our sample reach between 8 and 32 format sales. So on average, 64% of the total sales of the lifespan of these formats. So quite a range, but a good chunk of how they're going to perform, how they're going to be distributed. The superformats of the 2010s, the new superformats, have a significant geographical footprint. The 10 formats in our sample have reached more than 65 territories to date, for a cumulative 221 adaptions. So that's a lot of shows. Despite this, it is still relatively common for a superformat to fail to win over local audiences. So again, I know I stressed this before, but 45% of total international adaptations failed to be renewed for a second season. 45% failed to make it to a second season. Once the second season is secured, however, a superformat is likely to secure multiple renewals, so it does pick up. According to data from our research, international adaptations that were picked up for a second season had an average run of 3.2. So once you've made it past your first season, there's a sunny, bright future for you. I do think that perhaps if you are making a deal around adapting a show, purchasing it, or trying to work out the finances on it, I think that line is quite crucial. Knowing that a cancellation is massively likely to happen after the first season, and there's a nice data set for you to use there, is pretty crucial in terms of how exactly you recoup your investment on the adaptation of that show. Europe is the most prevalent market for superformat adaptations, at least in terms of total sales. Of the 10 markets for superformat sales, 8 were European countries, while the remaining 2 were the USA and Australia. Finally, I talked a little bit about this before. Asia is a small but growing market for superformats. East Asia made up 5% of total superformat sales of Europe and American formats in our sample. However, half of these sales were conducted in the past 2 years. When I did the original piece of research on the 90s formats, I highlighted that Asia was looking like it was going to break. It was the same sort of thing. It was the more recent formats that had been, most recently, Asia had been adapting some of these really old formats. And we can see a very similar trend in this data set, i.e. there hasn't been movement for a while. The last few years, we are starting to see uptake of these super formats. A little bit how we're also starting to see Western markets pick up some Asian formats that are perhaps getting a little bit long in the tooth, sort of 5 to 7 years old. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to go to questions. Oh, I see. I have a question. Lovely. So yes, if you jump onto your Q&A panel, I believe I have a chat as well, though I haven't been able to find it. So please do use the question and answer box, and I will do my best to answer your questions now. So first question, is there an afterlife for some superformat sales as a long tail repeat content, perhaps for streamers? That is a very good question. I'm going to answer that in 2 ways. Yes, there is a long tail. Yeah. It does depend on the show itself. I know that's quite a vague answer, but there are a number of shows which, yes, they do seem to lend themselves for repeatability. There's a couple of things that set them apart. Firstly, if you're looking for repeat content, your show can't have long story arcs. The majority of Superformats lend themselves quite well to that. They tend to be self-contained. But if you're looking for long tail repeat content, it has to be self-contained, and you can't necessarily expect the same degree of uptake if it's hard to follow. For streamers, there was a really interesting, it wasn't quite a trend. It was a factoid that we picked up while looking at this. There was a bit of evidence that some of the streamers are starting to, I don't want to overstress this, but they're looking at some formats in the same way that perhaps they've approached sports. So it is far too early to tell, and it feels a little bit more like they are testing the waters. But essentially, in a similar way to streamers looking at taking sports outside their key market, we saw a similar approach to some formats. So Amazon did this in two separate occasions. One of them, which is quite poignant, is X on the Beach in South America. So it co-produced the, well, I think it's wrong now. I think it was the Brazilian. It's in the report, and I'm happy to share it if someone wants to ping me a message afterwards if they're really keen. But they co-produced the Brazilian version of X on the Beach, and then they also produced an edited version of it, which they took across Latin America. So it's a way of using this content that has worked really well for streamers for other types of content, i.e. take something which is niche, aggregate this outside its home market, and perhaps amass a larger audience than would be possible or suitable for linear channels. I hope that answers your question. If it's not, do ping me an email and I'll be happy to discuss further. Next question. Are there examples of formats that not only have been adapted for specific secondary markets, but where market adaptations have an international, outside of home market life? That's a fascinating question. Examples that have not only been adapted for secondary markets. Yes. Let me think about that for a moment. There are some examples, yes. I have to say it's not something we specifically targeted as a piece of analysis in this report. There's definitely a number of, say, formats which come from smaller markets, which definitely, I think, exhibit the kind of the, what do you call it, factors design that I think you're talking about. So things like formats coming from the Netherlands definitely performed really well outside of home market. There's a couple of factors I noticed when looking at shows which pick up really well outside their home market, and that's concentrate on kind of 2 or 3 areas that are quite easily to understand. So 2 examples. One is the Masked Singer. The second is The Secret Life of, say, 4-year-olds. What was really interesting about that is they picked up on kind of stories that were universal. We all love kids. We all love silly masks. So picking on 2 or 3 strands and combining that into a single show made it applicable for a broader range. So don't just do a game show. A game show that has an appeal for adults, like a celebrity angle, has an appeal for kids, funny masks, and has a competitive feel, did much, much better. It had a wider appeal. And the same for Secret Life of 4-year-olds. It was an educational documentary, fantastic, but it was also, it was a very cute production. I don't know if everyone's seen it, but it was a lovely way to spend sort of an hour of your time. It was very sweet. And so it broadened the appeal, and I'd say that working that into a show made it have a really applicable out-of-home market life. I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to rush through these last 2. Otherwise, I think I'll get Karen shouting in my ear. What do you attribute Canada's decreased interest in Superformats? They went from being at the top a few years ago to none in your current study. I do apologise. It wasn't none. It just wasn't in our top 10. It was down at about 6, I think, maybe a little bit lower. But yes, that absolutely happened. I did some digging on this. I think one of the main causes behind this is that Canada is now much happier kind of watching American formats. In the past, back in the 90s, cable was far more segregated. Currently, with the way that sort of TV programming is distributed, it's a lot easier for Canadians to get hold of American TV. And if you look at some of the specific shows that are produced in the USA, there's actually a higher presence of Canadians within that. So there's a bit of a merging between US and Canadian formats. I think that's kind of where that's gone. They don't need to adapt the formats because they've been hybridized to some extent. Okay, I'll quickly do this last one. I guess we have seen first dates versions made in UK or New Zealand, early in Netherlands, as well as Netherlands adaptation. Yeah. I can't draw a question from that, but absolutely, that is true. First dates, interesting topic. It kind of, one of the key themes I found from all of these super formats was that the ones that do well, I know I mentioned this before, take a couple of themes that we are familiar with, combine them, and therefore make a broad show that was appealing for all of us. So first dates, we've all been on slightly awkward dates, I can probably hazard a guess. And this was quite nice because it was a kind of it wasn't just a trashy first dates show. It was a range of different topics. So thank you very much. I am 6 minutes over, so it is a classic Jonathan Broughton presentation. Thank you very much for listening. If you do have any questions, do get in touch. I think my email is on the invite. I'm not sure. If not, you can search for me. I'm Jonathan Broughton, and I am lead analyst at Broadcast Intelligence. So again, thank you very much for listening, and I will pass you back to Karen.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was really interesting, and thanks everyone for the questions. We do love a good Q&A session. My son and I loved the Masked Singer, actually, so it was good to listen to everything. So if anybody wishes to view the presentation again, that will be uploaded on the members only section of the CTAM Europe website. And if you have any questions, as Jonathan said, you can either email him directly or email info@ctameurope.com. And we hope that you will be on next week's weekly webinar Wednesday as well, which is Jack Davison from 3Vision, and he's presenting about the Disney Plus launch during a pandemic. So thank you for us both. Thanks, Jonathan, again. Everyone, hope you keep safe and wish you a great week. Thank you. Bye-bye.